Hello. So I'm gonna get into, this season's picks and whatnot, but I'm gonna start off by showing the model I have here. So a lot of the ideas for it come from College Football Nerds, and I had Claude essentially build the physical model itself, and I essentially told it what all I want to be in it. So I only do FBS and Power Four teams, including Notre Dame, since I don't find Group of Five games to be important info and they kind of skew stats. So you can see here, you can go through different teams, and the system itself gives, like a rating up here for each team. Not really the most important thing. So you can go through and select a category. So points scored, yards per attempt, yards per carry, and I'll have more categories for this year's model. This is just for last year. So I'll add things like sacks, turnovers, passing yards, total yards, everything like that. So you can see here in each category there's a different graph. So for points scored, for example, this is for Indiana, and the y-axis is for offensive points scored. It is, as you would guess, the number of points Indiana put up in said game. So, see here against Oregon, they put up 56, correlates there. And then the x-axis is pretty much the quality of the scoring defense they played. So over here, the best one they played is Ohio State. And I myself am an Ohio State fan, and I was at that game, in fact. So Indiana put up 13 on Ohio State, and the minus 55% you see here, what that's saying is Ohio State's scoring defense, uh, they're essentially holding teams they play to about 45% of their average points per game. Meaning if, a team Ohio State puts up 20 points per game, Ohio State's only going to give them 9 points on average. Obviously, as you can see here, teams have up and down games. Some are more consistent than others for sure. Um, and then I have those percentages as the x-axis. So, you see here the 55%, and then here's about 42% more or less. That's Miami. And then go to other categories and yards per attempt. So best passing defense Indiana played was Ohio State. Um, and defense as well, you can see. And this line here is a trend line. So it's sort of what Indiana on their average day is going to do versus each quality of defense. So for a defense as good as Ohio State's, this trend line would actually say they should be putting up more like 19 points, 20 points, something like that. So was a below average game for Indiana. The Miami game was a slightly above average scoring game. And then, yards per attempts. Indiana had a great game passing against Ohio State, as I personally saw. And, you have a really bad one like the Penn State game. So every team has this, ranks their most impressive games. That's whatever. You can go through their schedule, click on it, and every team is here. So I then have the model do its own custom rankings, mostly based on how many teams each team would beat if they, play. So Indiana, number one, and there's also the experimental model here, which has the same opinion. So you can also go separate categories, look at stuff like this. But for the overall rankings, it bases it off of what the model would predict. So, for example, we see Indiana and Notre Dame. Now, it's not exactly perfect. So, I think in the regular model, Ohio State does beat Notre Dame. But let's see, Notre Dame here. Okay. So, it's predicting, was it 15? Yeah, 15-point win for Indiana. And it gives you their yards per attempt and yards per carry for both teams. And so, how it calculates that is Indiana's points per game multiplied by the percentage um, of an opponent's average that Notre Dame allows. So it's back to that 55% below average that Ohio State allows right here. That means, again, they are basically allowing teams to put up 45% of their usual points per game. And then, for Miami, that's about 58% of their average. So, that's you're putting up 20 a game, Miami will give you 12. So, yeah, it takes Indiana's points per game and multiplies it with Notre Dame's scoring defense in the category of points that is. Same formula for, yards per attempt and yards per carry, just using those stats. But it's also added with the points per game Notre Dame gives up multiplied by Indiana's scoring offense. So Indiana, if I remember correctly, puts up 60% above average, meaning if a defense allows, let's say, 20 points per game, Indiana's going to put up 32, I believe that would be on average. And so it adds those two together and finds the average between them. And then, same thing for Notre Dame, just reversed. So this model I found is generally more accurate for in-conference games. So, you see here 16.8 to 13.9. That played out pretty accurately. Indiana passed a bit better. Uh, and Ohio State, I think we had 8.8 yards per attempt, but that was off of a 40-yard pass to Jeremiah. So, more or less, this was accurate as well. Rushing numbers were good. So, really, just the yards per attempt was the outlier here. You see Oregon here, I think is a fair one. I think that second game was a bit, well, fluky. Indiana was definitely better, but a particularly bad game for Oregon. And uh, Ohio State, Michigan here, pretty accurate for the most part. So you can do all that. Now, here's where it becomes a problem. If you do Ohio State versus, there we go, Texas Tech, for example. Okay, it has us winning, which is fair. Let's put Georgia though. Texas Tech wins. And I already had to correct it a lot. I remember going into the playoffs, it really loved Texas Tech. It, in fact, had them, I believe, the number two team. It was Ohio State, Texas Tech, then Indiana. So what I've tried to apply is conference multipliers. So the SEC gets their percentages boosted, uh, offense and defense. Big Ten and ACC a slight boost, probably half of the boost the SEC gets, and then the Big 12 is a third or so um, of their actual output because it really loves the Big 12. In fact, let's look at these rankings. You get Texas Tech, which 6 is high. That one's not crazy. Utah is 7 is pretty crazy. SMU's crazy. They're ACC, but let's see. Arizona, that one's not insane, but BYU as well. There's a couple of those that are just a little problematic. And I think especially it really undervalues the SEC since all the data points going into an SEC team's, page are other SEC teams. And it just makes them look a lot worse. It also makes their worst teams probably look better than they should be, but still. Now I have the experimental model as well. How this one works is it uses the trend line, as I showed, so like for Indiana, and it will look at the percentage in each category of the team that they're about to play, and it'll find on an average day how good will they do. So that model is going to spit out, if Indiana Miami play, it's going to spit out exactly what this number is here, which is about 25, I believe. Let me check this. So Indiana, Miami. Okay, 26. Yeah. Uh, so this one, not terrible. Um, for the most part, it's really just the SEC and Big 12 that are a little skewed. The occasional ACC team does get overvalued, but for in-conference games, that's fine. That's a good one. Let's see. Let me find a better example here. Oregon versus Washington. Let's see. Yeah, Michigan USC. That was a very strange game, but it's at least better. And then getting into Georgia and Texas Tech here, I believe. Yeah. So not wildly different in that regard. And that's where I'm trying to figure out a better way to implement conference advantages and whatnot. Uh, Definitely doesn't think either team's going to pass or run well in this one, which is fair. And the part that's hard is Texas Tech's defense kind of scaled pretty accurately. If you look at, Oregon putting up 20 points, and their offense itself only put up 16. So Texas Tech's defense really was that good. Their offense, though, was heavily, heavily overrated, considering they put up zero. So still trying to work it out. And I'll probably still be working on it by the time the season starts. But this model I tend to think is better for out of conference games. And you can see, conference ratings here. This also gives an idea of, you know, how good these different conferences are. I mean, this is one of the big things. The Big 12's offense is terrible. Their defense scales mostly pretty well. Um, but yeah, hope that makes sense. And then I'll get into predictions for the season after.